Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where we talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the season premiere of Riverdale. A great season premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. First and foremost, I knew about The Flash having a 5-part event. I had no idea Riverdale was having one until, after the fact. So that was interesting. But then, getting glimpses and seeing bits and pieces about what's going on, and a certain character that's going to pop up this season made sense tonally with what we're doing. Because I love the opening. I'm like, are we going full-blown Twilight Zoning here? It's like, yeah, we're not in Riverdale, we're in Rivervale. And so obviously we're picking up with some of the stories being what they are. That being Tony and Fang dealing with the whole baby Anthony situation. He has colic. It turns out that's why he's crying. They can't get any sleep. He's crying all the time. Obviously, the power couple that is Veronica and Reggie. So they're still doing their thing. And I love that we have Jughead being the host of it to an extent. We have Tabitha and him moving in together. Things between Frank and Alice are kind of oh, where's this going? And then Archie and Betty, which he's like, yeah, my old chum and my ex-girlfriend, so let's not go upstairs. Leave that to your imagination. But the moment Archie wakes up, he's like, oh, I had this nightmare. I was like, it is interesting. I was like, the house is still in order. And I was like, right. So I think what we're doing here is a coma situation. It's cliche, this character's been in a coma. Didn't they do that whole thing with The Sopranos? I think I remember hearing that was a thing in The Sopranos where part of us, maybe an entire season, or at least part of a season, was a dream sequence. I think the same thing kind of happens in Roseanne, if I remember correctly. It doesn't because the whole ending of Roseanne, the original run of Roseanne was oh yeah, we're basically making it so that it was her rewriting history. It was all kind of a dream in certain regards, and she changed. The whole thing was her writing her story, and it's a whole thing. She had changed some stuff along the way, but I was wondering, I'm thinking this is because Archie's having a dream. It's oh, we live in a town called Riverdale. It's yeah, he's in a coma right now, probably from the aftermath of the explosion. So, and Betty's just oh, that's kind of crazy. And so life is kind of continuing, but then there's also the situation with Cheryl, who is very vengeful about the fact is of hey, obviously Thornhill, it doesn't just, have one girl, obviously Cheryl had set up the fact is that she was going to take many girls under her wing and let that be a place for them to kind of grow and prosper. But yeah, Kevin had found a sacrificed deer, and there was all these runes drawn, but Cheryl's oh, this is Thornhill property, so you can't be here because they've succeeded from Riverdale, so they're their own place, so get off our land, we'll look into it. I'm wouldn't you want to be concerned about someone potentially performing rituals? But it's yeah, Cheryl's kind of diving into that darker side of things this season, but they are trying to find their way forward with Rivervale, of trying to help it out because, well, the maple trees have pretty much dried up in Thornhill anyway. So Archie kind of suggests the plan is to get some saplings and have every family in Riverdale grow one of their own. That way, take care of it and tend to it. That way, Riverdale isn't adherent to the blossoms anymore. They've relied on the blossoms for generation to be a big chunk of Riverdale's revenue. And now it's if we all have our own maple trees, we can sell the maple ourselves and kind of cut out instead of having Cheryl hold the whole town hostage in that regard. It is so interesting though, maybe if Archie did just simply give, at the time Archie was there was just so much going on at the time that he's right, let's just wait on this information. We're not trying to bury history or anything like that. To be fair, it's that's the thing of yes, what happened to her ancestor was tragic, but everyone, it's but I get it, you want to blame their families, but their families have gone through their own tragedies respectfully. It's what do you think, Archie, I guess it's Archie's hard times losing his dad and stuff, that's not enough of a, but it's no, she wants blood for blood. She wants I get it, anyone would, a family secret like that, my ancestor was burned at the stake. It's there are plenty of people who would want, no, don't bury this thing. So I can understand the sentiment behind it, but it's just harboring such a grudge against them. You know, especially Archie in particular, especially like him and Cheryl. Like, you know, it's like, right, you fell in, like, I will always think back to like when she fell into the ice and like Archie like broke his arm breaking into the ice to save her, like in season 1. I'm like, she's always been on decent enough terms with Archie. She's always played like the role of like, yeah, like she can be a little like doing her own thing. She can be very chaotic and destructive, and so like anytime she had an opportunity, she would try to spoil. When the Archie and Betty like made out, she made sure to tell like Veronica and Jughead. So, or maybe it was just, I don't remember, like maybe it was both of them, maybe it was just one of them, but it's like she's very particular about what she does and how she operates. She can be a little mean girlish. Well, she always had that element of her, but even more so, like she can be borderline cruel sometimes. So that's why I just feel so conflicted about like, because like she's pissed at everyone, but like the person who ends up getting most of her wrath is Archie, even to the point it's like he's like, oh, let me guess, like the Thornhill stuff, it's like over your dead body. She's like, no, Archie, over yours, which I'm like, he's probably like fighting for his life in the real world in Riverdale, and not. That's why I think this whole like 5-part event's going to be like all inside of his head. Like at the end of it, Archie's going to wake up like, oh, I guess like I'm such an idiot. The best example would be like Wizard of Oz, you moron. That's the classic example you go to of like, oh, you were there, you were there, you were there. Like I don't know why it took me till now to think, oh yeah, Wizard of Oz. But once again, very like Twilight Zone, especially with like the horror-esque theming and elements to it, because you do have like Cheryl playing this like role of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna help you all in certain regards. So for example, Fangs and Tony with the whole baby Anthony situation. Dr. Kurdick was like, oh, like, I could put a frog in your son's throat. Like, that was an old school classic legend remedy. And it's like, we're not going to let you put a... It's like, all right, well, if you don't want that, I recommend earplugs. So, but Fangs talked about, like, a serpent remedy that was like, hey, like, leave your child out in the woods and let them cry out the colic. I'm like, that seems very, like, old school way of doing things. But it's like, oh, it'll toughen baby Anthony up. I'm like... That's very, like, Spartan-esque of you. Like, oh, leave your child in the wild, and if they survive, they're strong because they'll come back. And it's, like, very, like, antiquated. I mean, I guess it's, like, a traditional thing, but I think that's so interesting. But didn't have to go that far because because it's interesting because, well, Cheryl showed up just when she did because Tony was in the woods. She's like, oh, let's go and get, like, some fresh air. I'm like, your timing is very impeccable this episode. But it's also like, I was surprised. I almost thought for a second, like, because, Tony was like, oh no, I'm just, like, she didn't want to admit what she was doing either because she would have felt bad about it. But, Cheryl promised to give her, like, a remedy from their family that would help with the colic and help solve it. So Tony accepts. But once again, like, she's like, oh, I'm handing out gifts, I'm helping people, but it comes with a stipulation. Like, Jughead killed a spider in Tabitha and him's new place. I knew he was a comic book dude, but even Archie's like, I didn't realize you had, like, this crap ton of, like, comics. But, like, she had said, like, oh, him doing that was bad luck. But then bugs start popping up all over the place because he poured a bowl of cereal, bugs. Tabitha woke up screaming, thinking, like, she had a nightmare about a spider, and she felt them all over herself. But then the next day she wakes up, it's, like marks all over her body and Jughead. So... she wants to hire an exterminator, but she opens up to Cheryl, and Cheryl's like, oh, I can help you, but I'm going to need yours. And, like, Jughead's up, and you're like, what are you up to? Then there's the Frank and Alice thing, which I love that Alice is like, yo, every time I'm, like, fixing you something, you immediately leave, running towards the door. It's like, I'm going to be frank with you. She's like, I like you. Paraphrasing here, but it's like, I like you, and I want you. And I'm like, oh, whoa, being so forward. But also in the back of my mind, I'm always like, man, that's always still the craziest thing to me. It's like everyone's family hooks up with somebody. Just because it's like, well, obviously there was the Jughead and Betty thing, but then there was the whole like FP and Alice thing like happening at the same time. So it's like, right. So it's like, oh, this is your Uncle Frank and your girlfriend's mom. So it's like, of course you got to keep that trend going, right? Well, it was interesting too because I guess like the conversation had come up before and like because Archie was like, oh, my mom was asking about we were going to do that thing we talked about. She's like, oh, she's like, I don't want to, about getting married. She's like, obviously like every like married couple we know in Riverdale is either dead or divorced, and you're like, Jesus, when you look at it, it's like, I mean, Yeah, it almost seems like it's a I mean, it makes sense. Like everyone, like I said, if you're not split up, your Damien's like, well, her mom and her dad, obviously his parents for Archie's situation, like marriages tend to not seem to last in Riverdale when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. So, but it's like no, the other thing they were talking about having a baby, but then like she finds out, Betty finds out from Kurdick, like, oh, it's not just her. Other women are having fertility issues too about the same age. So she had brought it up to Archie about adopting without, I guess she didn't really want to go into the ins and outs of like what was going on. But I think there's that innate part of someone who wants to go like, no, I want to go through the process of us having a child, because it's like, which isn't a takeaway from any adopted child, but I think in some people's minds it's the thing of like having a child of our own, like a child that's part you, that's part me, that we get to kind of, maybe it's that instinctual thing of like, I mean, there's the animalistic side of like, oh, our lineage needs to keep going, but maybe there's some part of it just like, right, like, but it's just for Archie, it's like, I want to go through the process of like having a baby with you, and she's like, I want to have your baby, but and he's like, then it'll work out, like it'll kind of all happen when it needs to happen. But I think it's just she didn't know how to really broach that subject. So not the only one in the relationship complicated situation, because you have Reggie, because he has a lot of insecurities in his mind. I mean, to be fair, him and Veronica went down this route before, but then it was like, Archie immediately came back into the picture again. So it is this situation of he's feeling insecure, especially because the guy like that she was talking to earlier, Cameron, was like, oh, you're just trying to work your way back to New York. And it's like, oh, so like what's going to happen to us? Like, she's like, no, I've given up on New York. Like, I'm going all in on the casino here and everything. So he just feels like, oh, I'm going to be left in the wind again. Like, right, I'm some small town dude. So it's like, right, you're going to move on from me because I'm not Archie, So eventually you'll move on and go back to New York and stuff like that now that you and Archie are split, or probably maybe even thinking on some level like, oh, you'll find your way back to Archie. He's always been in competition with Archie to some extent anyways. I even love the whole thing of like, oh yeah, she's like, yeah, I've always fantasized about making love on money. That is kind of like the gangster thing to do, to be like, oh yeah, we got all this money and just like, oh, let's make love on top of it. It's like, hey, I feel so weird when I say, oh, make love, because more often than not, I'm like, oh, bang it out. I don't know why. I guess it's just because of that Breathe Carolina song. Is what kind of why I use that term, that phrasing specifically, bang it out, regardless tangents and all that side. But it's just like, that's still like. But you can see where Reggie gets his insecurities from, because the moment it's like, yeah, here's the blueprint to the casino and everything. Oh, it's great. And he's like, yeah, notice that you didn't make me an office. She's like, oh, I'll get someone to redraw. But it's like, no, that in itself, a picture's worth 1,000 words. The fact is you didn't even think about giving me an office means I'm not kind of like in that forethought. Like, it seems like we're good, but, but it did be fair. It's a combination of his own insecurities. Plus that is a kind of like a little, it's kind of interesting that, we were business partners and everything, and yet you somehow still kind of forgot to include my office, I guess she could have swung it to be like, no, we're going to share an office. Like, I guess, like, it's like, no, that's clearly your office. And, it's like, if she did say, like, oh, we're going to share an office, it would have probably been like, oh, you're just saying that last minute. So, but also, I'm assuming it was Cheryl, but maybe it wasn't, who pulled up all those saplings. I mean, at first she left all like those little totem doll things, and you're like, okay, because it seemed like some of the girls aren't too keen on like what she's up to, but it's like, right, we'll do it because you're Queen Bee, like you're kind of like taking care of us, and you kind of took us all under your wing, so we'll do it. But it don't seem like they're 100% on board with what she has planned. But regardless, I just think that's fascinating. That once again, like, she goes so far with this, but then she claims later on, is like, no, I didn't do it. In fact, I'm actually here talking to everybody and like, oh, inviting everyone to the Maple Festival, and like Archie's almost like, wait, why are you guys like okay with it? Like the council and everything's like, why are you guys okay with it? You're just signing off on it? You're okay with it? Like, weren't you guys freaked out about her little warnings beforehand? And especially because Betty was doing some investigating of her own, because she ended up finding an old file of a ritual sacrifice that was in the same fashion as that deer, and notices that on the back of the thing it says RB as in like Rose Blossom. So, and it dates back like 50 years, and she confronted her about it, and Cheryl was so chill about it, so I guess like she knew, because like she knew what she had planned. But the moment she's like talking about like, all right, we're going to need someone to carry the sins of this place, especially when she started bringing up pagan stuff, I'm like, we know how the pagan stuff went down in a series related to this, let's stop being coy, Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. So we know how they kind of played out in that route. So I just thought that was kind of interesting in that element. I'm like, huh. Like, using pagan rituals and stuff like that, and it was them against the pagans in season 3, if I remember correctly. Yeah, Chilling Adventures. And so, or season 3, part 3. But she's like, yeah, we need someone strong to take up all the sins. I'm like, that sounds like you're aiming for Archie. And the whole thing was built around the moment. It's like, oh, cool, like, here's a pancake eating contest. Oh, you got to participate. Especially when Fang was like, hey, good luck today. Archie's almost like, what the hell was that about? And they're like, oh, you're participating in this. And then Jughead's like, yeah, I love you, buddy. I'm like, wait, are you guys co-signing this? It's like, because I was wondering, I was like, is it in a pancake? It's like, no, it's in the pie that he gets later. But I thought that was so interesting that they set that up like that. It's like, right, he was meant to lose against Reggie because it's like, cool, like, once again, Cheryl's helping out Alice and Frank, which I forgot to talk about. We found out, like, why Frank was so reserved, because turns out he was married and had a child, but had to keep them secret to the point Fred didn't know about it, Archie doesn't know about it, simply because it's like, right, as a mercenary, like, you got to keep your family safe, but we didn't get the full story there. But he made it sound like they weren't around anymore. Like, he was like, well, they're... he was saying something, I couldn't quite make it out. I don't know if he was saying, like, oh, they're gone, but it seemed like he was implying that. But, right, they kind of move past their barriers. They're going to her for help. Well, she's offering, but it's like, right, here I am, like, kind of almost like a djinn of be careful what you wish for type of thing. I'm like, I'll give you what you want, but it comes at a cost, like everything does, like, and even to the point, like, she's helping Veronica and Reggie, because it's like, right, we'll remove that Archie situation from your life. So, because Betty did say she found some stuff, but she's like, I'll tell you afterwards. And so Archie was meant to lose that final competition just so he could get the pie as a consolation prize. I thought that was interesting, like, why? But I guess, like, they needed Betty to be the crown because it was like her accepting, like, right, I got to give Archie up as a sacrifice, but also if I want to have a baby. So you're like, I guess that's what that was about. But it's like, yeah, she's like, yeah, she feels it later on after they banged it out on the table, nonetheless. But it's like, yeah, like, she's like, I'm pregnant, I'm having a son. Basically, like, oh, in 25 years, he'll be the Maple King. Because they made it seem like she was getting sacrificed. I'm like, man, this place cannot get enough of cults. If it's not the farm, if it ain't the Gargoyle King situation, it's just, man, this place is just real, like, just buried in, like, death and cults and stuff like that, and ritualistic stuff. But Archie shows up, and he's the man of the hour. They needed, like, a champion to kind of take all of this. I mean, it's like, right, you've always strived to save Riverdale, so this is your chance. And they sacrifice him, and he's looking like, are you guys really, like, okay with this? And it sucks. Because it's like, men have to be sacrificed because women need to carry on, like, have children to carry life on, so. Which, him being in that situation reminded me, speaking of the pagans, speaking of part 3 of Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, it reminded me of Harvey being inside the Green Man. It reminded me of that. Was it the Green Man or was it the Green One? I think it was just the Green Man, wasn't he? The being that the old god that they were, like, making a sacrifice to. It was very reminiscent of that to an extent, but I don't know if that was, like, his heart or whatever that they ultimately ended up cutting out, but they cut something out, and I'm assuming it was supposed to be. And so it's like, yeah, and just like that, Archie Andrews, born 25 years ago in Riverdale, dies here in Riverdale. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, don't worry, like, this is just the beginning. So I saw a peek of the next episode, but I didn't want to know anything. So that's why I'm like, is this going to be like a Twilight Zone, like, anthology thing of, like, every episode it's its own like horror-esque thing, or is it always going to like, because I wonder, are they going to do a symbolic thing of like everything, like say like they do different things every time, everything always ends with Archie dying just because it's being reflective of his current circumstances, but also, but that's what I'm wondering about. Or are we going to be a continuation of like, right, we're living it, it'll probably continue to be Riverdale, but I'm curious, is it going to be like built upon like, yeah, this is post Archie being sacrificed. I'm curious like how they handle this, because I did not watch the trailer for this season, and even once again, that's why I didn't even know this was in a 5-episode event. So I don't. These are just rhetorical questions. It's just me just like processing it and throwing it out there. I don't actually want to know. Like I said, I'm just throwing it out there, but. I'm curious to see how they handle this. Like I said, will it just be like and like almost like a loop where like Archie wakes up and like, oh, I can't believe that happened. What happened? Oh, like it must have been a bad dream, and kind of it plays out in different fashions time and time again across the whole event. Or, like I said, is it going to be built upon each other? Like, oh, Archie's dead, and just we start continuing on in Riverdale after the fact. Or I'm curious to see ultimately how they handle it. I'm excited to see how this event plays out, but also like what the rest of the season looks like, because I know the rest of the season isn't going to look like this. It's just going to be from this 5-part event at the beginning, so that's definitely going to be interesting. The Riverdale arc, but we'll ultimately have to wait and see how it all plays out next episode. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.